What are the parts of a yucca flower? I wanted to have a Joshua tree flower for this demonstration, but Red Rock Canyon this year apparently has not had the right climatic mix of rain, cold, and heat, such that practically none of the Joshua trees have bloomed this year. So I will simply substitute that with a yucca flower. Basically, the structures are the same, the shapes are different. But if you know what this looks like, then you can interpolate that over to a Joshua tree bloom. So let's start with the flower. This is the stem or pedicel. This is next to the stem is the receptacle, and this area is the base of the flower, and all of the leaves and the stamen and the sepals all connect right in this area. Now in this particular yucca flower there are 6 petal-like structures. 3 are actually real flowers that constitute the corolla, whereas the other 3, like this one, is the sepal. It has this line going through it like this. And it's more elongate than the actual petal, which doesn't have that line, and it's wider in shape. So in order to see what the plant looks like, we'll have to remove the sepals. Now I have this ruler up here so that you can have an indication of what the size of the different parts are. So let's remove what I'm calling the sepal. We'll put it up here, and the sepal is about, in this particular plant, about 2 centimeters. And let's put those there. And this is the 3rd one. So 3 sepals, 3 petals. These are the actual flowers. They form the corolla, around and protective of the reproductive portion of the flower. In order to see the reproductive portion, we'll have to remove at least one of these petals. And voila, we have the inside of the flower. Immediately recognizable. Again, this is where the sepals and the petals join at the base in this receptacle area. And also the stamen come all the way down, as you can see here. Hopefully you can see that, to this base area as well. There are 6 stamen in this area. They are recognized by 2 parts. Well, actually 3. This little bit of pollen at the end, the anther, and the filament. the pollen particles are made in this anthem, and then they are extruded at the tip of the anther. The filament is an elongated structure which I believe the main purpose is to get the pollen near to the stigma where pollination can occur. If the anther was way down here, then that flower would have a tough time self-pollinating and would be totally dependent on insects. So let's take a look here, and you can see in this particular view all 6 of the stamen. Now in the middle, that structure that has the sort of jagged rim is the top portion of the pistil. And the pistil is composed of the top portion, the jagged portion, which is the stigma, followed by a style, which is a tube that connects the stigma to the ovary portion of the structure. So, pistil. Pollen, anther, filament. The whole thing is called stamen. This is the male reproductive part. Let's remove a couple of those and put them up here for measurement purposes. And at this point, one can clearly see stigma, style, ovary, pistil is the name for all 3 of those parts. What happens in the Joshua tree flower? The Tegeticula moth enters the top of the flower when it's open, and for the typical Joshua tree, this opens slightly at nighttime. For the eastern type Joshua tree, the flower is slightly opened during the daytime. Either way, let's stick with the typical Joshua tree. So this is open at night, and the Yucca moth, the Tegeticula synthetica, enters the flower from the top and comes down to this section of the flower and starts gathering pollen from the anther. And after it has collected a pollen ball, which it tucks up under its chin by using special tentacles, it will then proceed down into the flower and penetrate the style somewhere along here with a structure called an ovipositor. The ovipositor drills a hole through here, at which point an internal organ or ovum tube passes through the opening, and the eggs are injected here. Then the moth moves back up the plant and stands in this area and starts pushing particles of pollen through the stigma down into the filament. That pollen makes its way down the style and into the ovary, which is down in this part. Reaches the ovules, which are the unfertilized eggs, fertilizes them, and then seeds form. At the same time, the moth's eggs are already in here too, and they have a safe place to grow, and once they start growing, they derive nourishment from the seeds which are formed by the plant. Therefore, putting this all together, you have a very unique association of this yucca moth and the Joshua tree. This process is called mutualism or coevolution. And what it means is that the yucca moth and the Joshua tree are codependent on each other in order to survive. Apparently, no other insect to any degree participates in the fertilization and propagation of the Joshua tree. So if that moth is reduced in numbers or is eliminated, the Joshua trees will not be fertilized and there will be no new Joshua trees. So theoretically, after a period of time, they would all disappear because they're not reproducing. Without the Joshua tree, the moth would not have a safe place to raise and nourish its eggs. Therefore, it would become extinct as well for lack of propagation. Moving on, once the flower has been fertilized and the seeds are beginning to form, these petals drop off and the larvae tend to grow. The larvae from the moth tend to grow and they feed on the seeds. Once the larvae get to a certain size, they actually break out of the ovary and crawl down the plant and form cocoons where they stay and mature until the following fall and winter. Then they come out of their cocoons and become moths, and the process repeats itself. As for the Joshua tree, the fertilized ovules then become the fruit, which produces these oblong fruit-like structures which contains seeds, the seeds that have not been consumed by the yucca moth larvae, and they then can spread by the air or they fall to the ground around the Joshua tree and are consumed by birds, insects, and are carried some distance away from the tree and are dropped, and there's a possibility that new Joshua trees can grow. So that's the interesting life cycle and co-evolution process of the Joshua tree moth and the Joshua tree flower.